Thank you very much, Michelle. I also want to give my thanks and gratitude to the Canada Gairdner Award group that invited us all to be with you today and to have this symposium. And you'll see in my presentation, it'll be a bit in parallels with what Mike has already presented. But before I do that, I do want to congratulate King as this year's awardee, if I can progress. And I was looking at a number of photos, King, and I was wondering, why are you always smiling? You're a very happy child, happy during midlife, happy in now times. But you're smiling. You are a very happy person. And so I started thinking, what could be those reasons? And one is because you do enjoy mentorship. And yes, that's me being mentored by King by the pool. He does it by the pool or in the office. It doesn't matter where. He also is happy because he has such a wonderful group of colleagues over the years that he has worked with. This is from Lund, Sweden, if you remember the chlamydia meetings. And he is also very successful in writing grants. You don't do all the work that King is associated with without writing grants and getting the funding to do it. And this is how he wrote those grants. It's how he taught us how to write papers and manuscripts. And it was a real learning lesson for me working with King on that. But it's also back to the mentorship. And we talked about this a bit last night, that he has cloned, as Alan said, these little kings all around the world. And here they are. It is truly impressive to just go through all these. The number of people that King has truly mentored or has influenced in one way or another their professional career. He's also an excellent listener. He enjoys listening to good lectures, working with colleagues like Judy and Hailey in global health. And certainly takes particular pride and joy in seeing graduates that he has trained receive their PhDs and move onward in life. But it's also because he knows how to enjoy the good life as well. And whether it's enjoying good wine or dressing up in black tie with his friends and colleagues, or taking care of his grandchild and getting close to her, or dancing with one of his other colleagues, Jeannie Marazzo, at one of the events. No matter how you cut it or slice it, King really enjoys life. He enjoys it in terms of the work that he has done and that he has fostered, the people that he has mentored, the individuals that he has worked closely with, and to see the results and the attention he has brought to the entire STD/HIV field is truly phenomenal. And with that, congratulations, King. You certainly have reason to be happy today. So now on to the lecture. End of AIDS. Mike set the stage. Told you about all of the excellent biomedical interventions, and I'll go a little bit more into detail on some of those. But before I do that, let's do a reality check. We're talking about end of AIDS, but here are the most recent numbers from UNAIDS. More than 70 million people in the world have been infected with HIV. 36 million have died. 35 million people are currently living with HIV, and last year we saw 1.6 million deaths. Although that is a decline from the 2.5 million in years previous, it is still a terrible, disastrous number that still is out there. And we had 2.3 new million infections that occurred last year. So let's just do the simple math. Here we are in end of 2012, 35 million people living with HIV. We've been able to bring treatment to 9.7 million people. Truly a phenomenal response that surpasses many other diseases we've had to face. 6.6 million have CD4s less than 350 at latest estimate. They're not on treatment. They lack access to care. And then there's 19 million that are in the wings waiting to get treated once they get diagnosed and get brought into care. Now, take the numbers that are feeding into today's pie. 2.3 million new infections coming in each year. And out of those that were less than 350, approximately 1.6 million deaths per year. So you can do the simple maths, projected out just 3 years. Let's go on out to 2016. That pie just got a whole lot bigger. We now have 20 million people who are in need of ARVs, 10 million in the ready to be treated but are not accessing care. And if we achieve UNAIDS targets, we'll have 15 million people on treatment. Still a phenomenal success, but the pie's bigger. And so it's kind of hard to, when you see those numbers, to understand why is everyone talking about the end of AIDS or an AIDS-free generation. And it's our political leaders as well as our scientists that are talking about this, whether it's former Secretary of State, the President of the United States, whether it's a number of different other political leaders like the former President Clinton talking about it, whether it's in Australia or some other country, or whether it's even being addressed at the State of Union address in the United States. They are talking about an AIDS-free generation. And so with that as the backdrop, I now want to try and answer that question. Can we achieve this? And you will be the judge. It's all based on all of 30 years of research that Mike has just alluded to, all the different interventions, whether it's treatment as prevention, PrEP, or it's behavioral interventions, it's microbicides, it's STI treatment. You all go around, and what we are being charged with is let's get all of these interventions implemented to try and prevent HIV infection and to prevent people from dying from this disease. So where have we succeeded? We can have an AIDS-free generation by 2015, absolutely, if you define it as no more children born to HIV. That will be a generation born free of HIV and AIDS. And perinatal transmission, which is all based on all the scientific intervention trials, working our way through, we now know what works. It's called treatment as prevention in terms of treating the mother during pregnancy and after delivery. And if you do that, as shown in just one graphic from the US, you essentially are eliminating or creating an AIDS-free generation for those babies being born into the next generation of life. So there is optimism that we can have an AIDS-free generation. In fact, PMTCT, the prevention of mother-to-child transmission, has averted close to 1 million child infections just in the last 4 to 6 years. And that number is going to get bigger and bigger as we go forward. So lots of great optimism. And you can take that same biomedical intervention looking at transmission sexually. And Mike's already gotten into treating individuals who are HIV infected, lowering their infectiousness, lowering their viral load, and achieving the same type of outcome that we saw with prevention of mother-to-child transmission. While Mike was spending his 12 years doing all the build-up to 052, launching it and going through, multiple other groups were doing observational studies. And although they're not valued as absolute truth, the randomized trials are, nevertheless, they're getting close to a 60% reduction in HIV transmission in these observational studies where ART was being provided in discordant couples or in populations. And then, of course, 052 came along as the first major randomized trial that, and we won't need another one, with a 96% protection efficacy. It clearly set the stage that with this type of intervention, If we can roll it out to everyone who's infected, lower their infectiousness, we can, in fact, achieve the end of AIDS. And we'll go into the challenges with that. The key is getting ART out to all the infected population, as we talked about, and we're making great strides. I mean, to say that within the last 6 to 7 years, we've gone from 1 million up to almost 10 million people accessing ART is just, I keep saying truly phenomenal, because I'm always amazed that we have been able to achieve, and there were lots of naysayers who said this could never be achieved, and it is happening today. And Mike mentioned that you can go from observational studies and the randomized trial to then community effectiveness. And so far, the best one out there has been the Tanzer study, which he already talked about, which is that for every 10% increase in coverage of ART, you get a 17% decrease in HIV incidence in that population. And it's all on the basis of those trials, those observational studies, that WHO finally came around just in June of this year, so very recent, expanding ART on the basis of the guidelines that everyone should be treated, particularly those with CD4s less than 500, and we should prioritize those at less than 350 to prevent those fatalities that we were talking about. The rollout of ART and those studies were happening concurrently with the results of the circumcision trials, which were completed in 2007. They were rolled out, and if we look now in Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda, I'm showing the Uganda graphic, that in the community where circumcision has been rolled out, we are seeing a 73% community effectiveness in the reduction of HIV incidence since the end of the clinical trials. So this is, again, heralded as a huge success, and yet it hasn't really taken off the way it should have, and we'll return to that in a minute. And a lot of people say, well, that's the benefit some men, but women benefit as well as the partners of circumcised men. And this is the results of the randomized trial that we did in Uganda, looking at reductions in high-risk HPV in the women who were partners of the circumcised men versus the partners of the uncircumcised men. Bacterial vaginosis was reduced. Trichomonas vaginalis was reduced, as was genital ulcer disease, both in the men and in their female partners. So talk about a public health benefit of a single intervention that you do once and is not as dependent as taking a drug every day. And yet, we just don't see it taking off. And I know in Canada, male circumcision is not avidly promoted. It's not promoted in the U.S. And it's something we could talk about a little bit later on. Let me move to the next major intervention, and that's the PrEP trials. And Mike had alluded to these. These are spelled out. All of these showing great efficacy, anywhere from 39% all the way up to 75%, whether it's tenofovir or Truvada being used, whether it's a microbicide or it's being taken orally. These were very successful. So you could protect individuals who were being exposed but not infected if they were to take their drugs and be adherent to them. So when you put all of those successes together, you influence public policy to say, we can aspire, as Mike said, aspirational, aspire to the end of AIDS if we could just scale all these up. So let's talk about what's holding back on those scale-ups. So the first is getting countries and the public policy makers to really scale it up. And I hope Jamie Blanchard will talk about where program science could come in to address why is this happening. We know these work. Why aren't they being scaled up? Then there's the problems in the care continuum, access, retention, and adherence to therapy. Then there are the social and cultural barriers. Stigma, still highly persistent throughout many countries. The legal impediments to really rolling these out. And lastly, as we come back to even talking about the syphilis in China and some of the other issues, it's human nature. It's recidivism at its worst in the face of success. So those are the challenges. Let me give you the data behind why I singled those out. This is looking at coverage of ART for prevention of mother-to-child transmission. I just told you this is achievable by 2015 if the countries could just roll it out. Look at North Africa and the Middle East, a 6% uptake, 19% in East and Southeast Asia, 27% in Western and Central Africa. This is really pathetic because we know this works. So there's something holding these countries back from really scaling up PMTCT. What about male circumcision? Very culturally sensitive issue. We have circumcised 3.2 million men in Africa by the end of 2012. That's only 16% of the 20 million target that UNAIDS set out. Why are we so slow to make that? Are we going to make that many by 2015? It's a long haul. What about ART coverage for the infected people who have CD4s less than 250? And you can see it varies depending on what country. So I can't generalize for all of Africa. But you can see in a country like Botswana, it's great. They're scaling that up dramatically. But if we go to Madagascar or the DRC, where I originally started work, we're at 5 to 10%. So very sad situation. But let's not dwell on Africa. Let's go to the United States. Where's our problem? Our problem's the care continuum. This is from the Centers for Disease Control. You start out with 1.2 million infected people. How many are virally suppressed? That's what's going to decrease HIV transmission. 28%, 1 out of 4 individuals at best. That's changing, but it's slow to change. And I wish I had more time to show you where it is changing, like in places of British Columbia, actually, where I've seen some of their more recent data, or even King County. Now, the PrEP trial, as I said, were a fantastic success in protecting individuals against HIV. But that's dependent on whether they take the drug or not. And 2 trials singled that out dramatically, and that's the FemPrep trial and the VOICE trial. And we won't go into their details, but look at the percent of the blood samples in the treatment arm, the arm of individuals that were supposed to be taking the drug. They only 26% to 20% were adherent, and hence they were futile studies and were stopped prematurely because they would never show a efficacy impact. So you need to take the drug to actually see the efficacy. And the best trial that showed that, I thought, was IPREX, and then the more recent one, which was injecting drug users, showing that as they took PrEP and got adherence, up to 97%, they got an 84% efficacy rate compared to the control arm with not taking it. So adherence is really a big threat. Now, I mentioned that there's social stigma and there's other issues. Turns out, Human Rights Watch pointed out that sex workers were being arrested if they carried condoms, multiple condoms, as evidence used for commercial sex. Homosexuality is still illegal in 76 countries of our world. We are not going to achieve that reach out to the population at greatest risk if we still have these legal and social stigma attached to it. To give you an example of injecting drug use, which is still illegal in most countries, if you look at HIV cases among people who inject drugs, this is looking at low and middle income countries. They make up 62% in some of those studies, and yet only 22% of those infected, well, that's the prevalence in injecting drug users, and only 22% are actually put on therapy. So again, it's a disconnect. You have a high rate of infection in these individuals, and yet very few accessing ART. So when we talk about treatment as prevention, we need to get people on treatment, and these legal and social barriers are a problem. I'll then turn to the recidivism and the other issues about diagnosis. Mike talked about acute HIV, and if we go to England, to the London studies, it's clear that HIV incidence is increasing in MSM, and they postulate that most of it is due to undiagnosed transmissions occurring during acute HIV, and those people subsequently transmitting before they get on treatment, because the National Health Service of England will provide ART for people who are infected, but catching the acutes is problematic. What about the United States? We're still seeing a rise in African-American men who have sex with men. This is 2008 to 2011. To update the data, look at the purple line at the very top, showing a steady increase. I think King had pointed out the sad number of 50,000 annual cases. This is going up in certain segments of the population. And if you look at the age distribution, it's particularly going up in the young people. They're not worried about HIV anymore. There is a success associated with the treatment, with some of the prevention interventions, and hence it doesn't have that scare tactic that it did in the late 80s and early 90s. So that's something we're going to have to deal with. But let's focus on Canada. Go to British Columbia. Highest rates of syphilis being reported in British Columbia, shown in the dotted line among men who have sex with men, showing that this is not just a U.S. problem, this is a Canadian problem as well. And King already showed this slide. When I saw this graphic, I, like King and Hunter and others, were just overwhelmed by the fact that syphilis is escalating to the highest rate, I understand, in King County among men who have sex with men who are HIV positive. I mean, there's something wrong with this picture. And it's why I postulate we need to address all these challenges in implementation of all these proven efficacious trials if in fact we're going to beat this. So I want to pull up a slide to remind King that he was one of the first who came out with highly active retrovirus prevention. He called it HARP. We call it combination prevention, but he coined that term. Here we go. It's from King in 2003, 10 years ago. We've been talking about this, and yet we're not seeing the fruits of this yet, and I think we just have to work harder. King actually had it all caught in there. He had PrEP, he had treatment as prevention, STD control, circumcise, be faithful, abstain, all of the major ingredients except PMTCT, but that's okay. You were focused on sexual transmission on that one. So I borrowed this slide from my boss, Tony Fauci at NIAID. And if we stay the course, you're looking at the red line, the status quo. But if we could scale up treatment, the way Mike had advocated, the way I also would like to advocate and include HARP, or combination prevention, we will see declines, but we won't see the end of AIDS. To really do that, according to Tony Fauci, we need a vaccine. And I think you heard that for chlamydia, you heard that for gonorrhea. We know that has already been achieved to some degree with HPV as it gets rolled out. I think we do need a vaccine, and that would take us further along the road to getting this taken care of. So let me conclude. Extraordinary progress has been made in the rollout of ART, and we can reach the target of 15 million people being treated. And I think PMTCT, if we could get those lagging countries up to scale, we could actually achieve close to elimination of the next generation acquiring HIV in our children. Further, Scale Up must address the disparities and inequities, and maybe Michelle will talk about this during the roundtable. That is focusing on the countries hardest hit and the key populations. And I think countries right now, individual countries, whether it's Canada, the United States, or Uganda or any other country, they face strategic decisions of where to put their money in the program policies to try and roll this treatment and scale up out. And we'll hear about that in the next presentation as to how to use program science to do that. But finally, I believe, and I firmly believe this, antiretroviral therapy for treatment and prevention are our best tools at the present time to ending the AIDS epidemic. We don't have a vaccine now. We're not going to have one for a while, so we need to put all our energies into this. But we have to underscore the importance of behavioral change, adherence, retention in care, and complete scale-up to all countries. So imagine a world without AIDS. That has to be our aspiration, and I actually think if we could, as a global society, work towards that particular goal as an aspiration, we will ultimately succeed. So thank you very much. Congratulations, King.